Hi, and good evening, everyone. Welcome. I'm Kathleen at the National Council for History Education. Joining me tonight, my colleagues Shauna and Yasmin, and we are very excited tonight to bring you Elliott Drago. Elliott is joining us tonight from Philadelphia and the Jack Miller Center, which he joined in 2022. He is the resident historian and manager of the History Initiative. And among the many things he writes and edits for the center are their newsletter, including a monthly K-12 teacher newsletter. He also publishes historical pieces in popular outlets such as RealClear History and Civics, academic journals, and serves as an editor as part of the editorial team for the forthcoming online American Tradition Library. So before joining the Jack Miller Center, Elliott, as we were just talking about, actually taught in public high schools and universities across Philadelphia. So he is here tonight to talk to us about his book, Street Diplomacy, The Politics of Slavery and Freedom in Philadelphia, 1820 to 1850. And we mentioned to him earlier that some of us will be visiting Philadelphia in the month of June. So this is great background for us. So take it away, Elliott, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Let me just do the share screen here and start it. All right. First of all, I'd like to thank Kathleen Barker, Shauna Liverati, Yasmin Forbes, and the National Council for History Education for inviting me to speak. I'd also like to thank everyone here, you teachers. I know you all have had a long day, so thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. I'd like to give you a brief history of how I got here and maybe even how I ended up writing this book. I grew up in Chester County, Pennsylvania, home of one of the most traveled escape routes that helped form the Underground Railroad. As a child, I loved reading about the daring rescues, as well as all the Underground Railroad stops, stations, and conductors in Pennsylvania. But one moment from my childhood stands out and perhaps set me on the path to writing this book. My best friend's house in elementary school was an actual station on the Underground Railroad, complete with removable floorboards and a subterranean hiding spot. I can still remember walking down those wooden steps, my heart racing the entire time, feeling like it would burst. Little did I know that 30 years later, I would publish a book, one in which some of the people I studied may have breathed the same air in that very same Underground Railroad station in Chester Springs, Pennsylvania. So tonight we're going to ponder 3 questions, but before I do that, I'd like to share a short story that I discovered while writing this book. It's called The Famous Grasshopper War, and it comes from a letter the minister Noah Worcester wrote to the Philadelphia abolitionist Robert Vaux in 1822. It begins, 2 Native American children quarreled about a grasshopper. The women became enlisted for the children, and finally the men engaged in the quarrel and commenced a war which occasioned the extermination of a great part of 2 tribes. Let's keep this story in the back of our minds as we proceed. I'd like to explain also the scholarly reasons for why I devoted myself to this project. When I was a student at Villanova University, walking through the library, I happened to catch a glimpse of a book called Slave Patrols by Sally Haddon. Fascinating book that looked at slave patrols in the Carolinas and Virginia leading up to the Civil War, and it made me wonder who were the people who would patrol, obviously, but also the people who would pursue those supposed fugitives from slavery. So the second book that influenced me was Carol Wilson's book. And in Carol Wilson's book, Freedom at Risk, I found sort of a throwaway couple pages detailing an interview with a professional slave catcher, a man named George Alberti, who plied his trade in slave catching for 40 years in Philadelphia. So these combinations of slave patrols, people who are chasing after the enslaved, kind of came together in a book called Border Wars, in which Stanley Harold, the author, introduced this idea of comity to me, not comedy as in laughter, comity, C-O-M-I-T-Y, which means friendly relationships between states and the process by which you maintain those relationships. He also introduced this idea of interstate diplomacy. But I wanted to complicate that idea of interstate diplomacy by focusing on non-elite historical figures. In other words, ordinary people like us. So the more I researched this idea of interstate diplomacy, the more I researched this idea of professional slave catchers, the more I became fascinated with the collaborations between Black and white Americans in Philadelphia. Sorry, got screwed up there. My book argues that ordinary Black Americans living in Philadelphia bore the burden of comity, and they and their allies practiced what I called street diplomacy, which is the up-close and personal battles over freedom that connected the local, state, and national politics of slavery. So the word street refers to the local struggles over slavery and freedom within Philadelphia. These struggles included kidnappings, pursuing fugitives from slavery, rescues and riots, all of which happened in public spaces. Studying the politics of slavery and freedom at the street level also encourages analyzing the day-to-day activities of Black Philadelphians and their abolitionist allies. So once again, Stanley Harold, I borrow his term diplomacy from his work, in which Harold studied slave state, what he called diplomats traveling to the north to convince northern state legislatures to help them retrieve fugitives from slavery. So northern state legislatures like Pennsylvania debated slaveholders' pleas while at the same time endeavoring to define their own sense of states' rights as well as maintain comity. So Pennsylvania laws had national consequences, and these consequences dealt with freedom and slavery. So my task in this book was to connect local struggles over freedom on the streets of Philadelphia by expanding the ranks of these diplomats to include ordinary people and show how these ordinary people influenced local, state, and national politics. So the first question we're going to ask here is why Philadelphia? So let's go into a little bit of historical context. First of all, no other city in the United States can boast of hosting the signing of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention. Remember, too, that Philadelphia served as the capital of the United States until 1800. So what happened in this city automatically resulted in larger national ramifications. We know that first President George Washington brought enslaved people to live with him in Philadelphia. The most famous person who labored under Washington was Oni Judge. She escaped, which launched Washington's crusade to pursue her across state lines. Also, the Federal Fugitive Slave Act was passed in Philadelphia in 1793, which was a legal mechanism to retrieve supposed fugitives from slavery. This clause buttressed the fugitive slave clause in the United States Constitution by imposing fines and jail time upon those who aided supposed fugitives. However, the federal government in 1793 was tiny, and therefore it faced a personnel issue. There were never enough federal officials to enforce the 1793 Federal Fugitive Slave Act. Therefore, the question of how the federal act would be executed fell onto states, in this instance, Pennsylvania. And since all politics is local, in reality, ordinary people in the streets of Philadelphia were forced to make spur-of-the-moment decisions, as more often than not, the issue of alleged fugitives from slavery and kidnapping victims became confused and conflated. Second question I like to ask about Philadelphia or explain about Philadelphia. Sorry, I'm scrolling here. My fault. Why Philadelphia again? Well, a cosmopolitan city in William Penn's holy experiment of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia boasted the headquarters of the Pennsylvania Abolition Society. And I'm going to abbreviate them PAS from here on out. The PAS, whose efforts included petitioning state and national government officials, assisting Black Americans, and passing the legislation that became the first Gradual Emancipation Act in the Western Hemisphere in 1780. This 1780 Act outlined the rules and regulations to gradually abolish slavery in Pennsylvania. Importantly, it stated that every child born of enslaved mothers after the bill's passage would be considered servants to their masters until they turned 28, when they would receive their freedom. Section 5 of the act made the importation of enslaved people illegal and required masters to register their enslaved workers annually. Section 10 of the act prohibited non-residents of Pennsylvania from keeping their enslaved workers in the state longer than 6 months. So why Philadelphia? The Quakers. Pennsylvania Quakers, Philadelphia Quakers in particular, were instrumental to passing the state's 1780 Gradual Emancipation Act. Their ties to Philadelphia's Black community and white elites helped pass anti-kidnapping laws, and their on-the-ground street-level efforts were just as meaningful. Most importantly, I chose Philadelphia because it contained the largest, most vibrant, most strident, and best organized Black community in the country. Whether emancipated during the liberating fervor of the Revolutionary era or freeing themselves through direct action, Philadelphia was the recipient of a, quote, steady traffic of Black Americans. Upon arriving in Philadelphia, the strength of the Black community was on full display. Through sites of resistance located in Black churches like Mother Bethel AME, led by Richard Allen, who doggedly fought for freedom for decades in the streets, on the pulpit, and in the State House. But Mother Bethel AME and Richard Allen did not go unscathed. In 1825, a group of young ruffians poured red pepper into the stove of the church during a service, forcing a stampede to the exit and the resulting injuries. Churches like Mother Bethel were also targeted by white gangs who would often gather after church services and pick fights with Black Americans leaving religious service. So as you can see, Black Philadelphians' freedom could be questioned at any time. Writing in 1813, wealthy sailmaker and Black community leader James Forten shared how local law enforcement and city officials made a sport out of accusing Blacks of being runaway slaves. Quote, "The constable, whose antipathy generally against the Black is very great, will take every opportunity of hurting his feelings. Perhaps he sees him at a distance, and having a mind to raise the boys in hue and cry against him, exclaims, 'Hello, stop him.' The boys, delighting in the sport, immediately begin to hunt him, and immediately from 100 tongues is heard the cry, 'Whoa, where is your freedom certificate?' Can anything be conceived more degrading to humanity?" Forten would act as a sometimes silent, sometimes very vocal partner of abolitionist efforts, with his house becoming a stop along the Underground Railroad in the years to come. A few years after Forten wrote these words, a Black woman named Ann Chambers was ripped out of her employer's house by 2 constables and a slave catcher. The men threw her into a carriage and took her to Judge Richard Peters, who believed Chambers' defense of her freedom. On the way back through Philadelphia, the men debated whether they should still bring her down south to sell her. They lost their nerve and instead shoved her out of the carriage onto Arch Street and, quote, told her to dry her tears, wipe her face, and not tell any of the damned Quakers anything about their conduct, end quote. Chambers picked herself up from the cobblestones on Arch Street in Philadelphia, a woman neither completely free nor completely fugitive. Sorry. Constables, corrupt city officials, slaveholders, kidnappers, and slave catchers operated in Philadelphia, kidnapping or retrieving Black Americans on a daily basis. Consequently, clashes between the forces of slavery and freedom within the city erupted in multiple ways. Riots, rescues, street battles, arrests, and removals were common sights. Whether these clashes arose through riots or mundane arrests, these experiences changed the participants' lives. The arrest of an innocent Black American forged links to their opponents and allies in the city, state, and nation. But Black Americans found support from the acting committee of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, the PAS, a wing of young entrepreneurial white men who embedded themselves in the Black community in Philadelphia, interviewed them, and helped them find legal counsel. In fact, this committee's records contain most of the cases that I discuss in the book, including the cases that inspired Pennsylvanians to pass the nation's first anti-kidnapping law, also known as the 1820 Liberty Law. The easiest way to understand these liberty laws is to think of them as states' rights documents meant to protect citizens within a given state. You can see how these state laws, or these liberty laws, might disrupt interstate relationships and exacerbate legal retrievals under the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. While historians have studied liberty law debates in the state legislature, I was more interested in the cases that instigated these debates, as well as how these cases intertwined kidnappings and retrievals and connected the local, state, and national politics of slavery. First, the case of Abraham Quamany. In 1816, Captain John Milner and William Miller of the sloop Betsy of Philadelphia hired Quamany, a free black boy, to collect wood in New Jersey. Instead, the men kidnapped and sold him to the notorious Cannon Johnson gang, an interracial group of kidnappers who operated in the Delmarva Peninsula, the Delmarva meaning Delaware, Maryland, Virginia Peninsula. Jesse Cannon, his wife Patty, Joe Johnson, had operated as kidnappers for over a decade at that point, and tales of their misdeeds, including murder, were legion. When the PAS sent acting committee members and black witnesses to investigate the kidnapping of a young black girl in 1819, Delaware abolitionists warned them once they were near the gang, they were, quote, among the friends of Cannon and surrounded by persons engaged in the same trade, end quote. The abolitionists and the black witnesses came up empty-handed in their search, and that was the last time the PAS sent its members to the gang's hideout. Returning to Quamany, although chained and beaten by the gang for 3 days, he managed to escape and make his way back to Philadelphia, where he met with the acting committee. The acting committee convinced Philadelphia Mayor Robert Wharton to issue arrest warrants for Miller and Milner, who were tried and convicted of kidnapping. Their fine, $100 and a year in prison. The Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society then lobbied Pennsylvania Senator Jonathan Roberts and U.S. Representative Joseph Hopkinson to bring their petitions to the national legislature, but it was to little effect. The second case that led to the creation of the 1820 Liberty Law in Pennsylvania exposed the terror Black Americans faced from within the Black community. In 1817, a Black man named William Young, quote, seduced 3 other Black men, John Wood, John Dorden, and Benjamin Bennett, into helping him load wood in Delaware. These 3 men were never heard from again, though according to witnesses, Young had transformed upon his return. He appeared, quote, better clad and had the command of more money, end quote. The acting committee and an unnamed Black abolition society, which suggests the level of secrecy required for it to operate, both groups pressed charges against Young, who appeared before Judge Richard Rush in 1818. Rush is there on the left. Rush lamented how, quote, while the law punishes a man who steals a horse with hard labor for 7 years, it imposes for stealing a man a fine of 100 pounds and hard labor not exceeding 1 year, end quote. Now here is the perfect example of how we can start connecting dots between the local, state, and the national. Pennsylvania Governor William Finley used the exact same language, this language of stealing a horse versus stealing a man, 7 years versus 1 year. Pennsylvania Governor William Finley used this exact same language in his annual message to the state legislature in 1819. But while Pennsylvanians debated the ongoing realities of kidnapping at the local and state levels, their national representatives spoke out against the spread of slavery during the Missouri Compromise debates of 1819 to 1821. Once again, Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society ally and U.S. Senator John Sargent remarked during the course of these debates that, quote, if Congress failed to restrict the further spread of slavery into Missouri, then a great inland domestic slave trade, end quote, would be established in the United States, complete with the, quote, horrors of the Middle Passage and the most cruel accompaniments of that hateful traffic, end quote. So as these examples illustrate, bad things certainly happen in Philadelphia. Yet exploring these bad things ought not blind us to moments of hope, which we will address shortly. All the cases that I described were used by Pennsylvania lawmakers in the state legislature as evidence to increase the penalties for kidnapping. The combined forces of the PAS, their political allies, and Black Americans resulted in the 1820 Pennsylvania Liberty Law, which made kidnapping a felony, increased the fine to $500, as well as the prison sentence to a minimum 7 years, and prevented some state officials, like local officials such as aldermen, from granting certificates of removal. These certificates of removal would remove supposed fugitives back to enslavement. Only state judges or recorders maintain their power to issue removals under this law. This law became the nation's first liberty law, one adopted by other northern states, and more importantly, the first to prohibit state officials from enforcing the National Fugitive Slave Act. However, the slave states would not sit idly by and allow their northern neighbors, who they viewed as bound to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act of 1793, to pass more liberty laws, which the slave states identified as a threat to comity, right, those peaceful relationships between states, threats to comity as well as threats to the Union itself. Maryland slaveholders became so frustrated with Pennsylvania for hampering efforts to, quote, retrieve their property, namely by practicing street diplomacy. For example, in 1820, a Black man named John Reed, who freed himself from enslavement in Baltimore, killed both his former enslaver and overseer when the pair came to retrieve him in Pennsylvania. Yet at his trials, Reed actualized street diplomacy by injecting plausible deniability, by forcing white Pennsylvanians to make harrowing distinctions between legal and illegal removals. For in the first trial, he was acquitted for acting in self-defense, but in the second trial, he was convicted because he acted in self-defense. In other words, Reed's choice to defend himself meant he was, in fact, a fugitive from slavery. Other cases like that of Reed's forced the state of Maryland to send commissioners to the Pennsylvania legislature in 1826 to convince Pennsylvanians to revise the 1820 Liberty Law. Street diplomats from Philadelphia sprang into action. Stephen Gloucester and Richard Allen, two prominent members of the Black community, cornered state lawmakers in Harrisburg. Allen explained his own near kidnapping to Philadelphia Representative William Meredith. In a letter to Meredith, Allen explained that he spoke for a, quote, large body of colored persons, end quote, many of whom, as James Fortin attested in the letter to Allen, were threatened with kidnapping on a daily basis. Allen also noted the kidnapping crisis currently unfolding in Philadelphia. A group of Black children had been kidnapped, beaten, and two even murdered by the Cannon Johnson gang, and only through the combined efforts of two Mississippians, the mayor of Philadelphia, and Black Philadelphians were the remaining children saved and brought back to the city. The PAS also sent representatives to convince lawmakers to stay the course and not compromise with slaveholders. The Pennsylvania legislature ended up crafting a law in which Pennsylvania state officials could now issue removals through a complicated state-run process, which protected free Blacks, but also modified the federal retrieval process. Allen, Gloucester, and other Black Philadelphians, as well as the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society, had convinced lawmakers to disallow slaveholder testimony in court. Instead, slaveholders would need a signed affidavit from their place of residence. And this new section of the 1826 Liberty Law denied slaveholders federal right to retrieve fugitives from slavery, which in doing so modified the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. Philadelphia remained a hotbed of abolitionism in the decade that followed the 1826 Act. Black abolitionists convened numerous times in the city, and a new wave of abolitionists clamored for immediate, uncompensated emancipation. Labeled fanatics or worse by their opponents, these immediatists were led by people like Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, and Robert Purvis. Purvis, a mixed-race man who helped hundreds of Blacks who freed themselves and saved the lives of hundreds more potential kidnapping victims, lived in Philadelphia for decades. Street diplomats in Philadelphia, like Purvis, worked to conflate kidnapping attempts with efforts by slaveholders to retrieve so-called fugitives. In addition, Black Philadelphians formed organizations such as Vigilance and protecting societies to prevent kidnappings and fugitive retrievals, which, quote, had been carried on in Philadelphia by a set of unprincipled men for some years past, end quote. Black Philadelphians refused to surrender their freedom without confrontation and conflict. These organizations worked in conjunction with the PAS, breaking down barriers between Black and white abolitionists. Black Philadelphians and their allies faced increasing hostility from white Philadelphians and their political allies. 4 major riots rocked the city of Philadelphia between 1834 and 1842. In 1834 and 1835, white rioters burned down significant portions of Black Philadelphia, and the Philadelphia grand juries who investigated these riots firmly placed blame on interracial abolitionism, the attempted rescues of supposed fugitive slaves in the city, and Black social uplift. Street diplomats like James Forten were targeted during these riots, and hundreds of Black Philadelphians lost everything in the chaos. In 1838, abolitionists and activists built Pennsylvania Hall, which was envisioned to be a temple of liberty in Philadelphia. Upon the urging of Philadelphia Democrats, white rioters burned the hall down 3 days after it opened. So the final question I'd like to address is short yet complicated. Whose fate? After all, we are hearing stories about Americans enslaving other Americans. What does slavery have to do with the fate of our nation? Simply, everything. We will return to this point soon enough. The destruction of Pennsylvania Hall made Philadelphia abolitionists even more resolute in their work. Robert Purvis reorganized the Vigilant Committee, and by 1839, the committee handled at least 3 cases per week and revealed numerous successes in spite of significant anti-abolitionist, anti-Black backlash. Writing later in 1833, Robert Purvis described his most memorable experience serving under the Vigilance Committee, which was a stunning example of street diplomacy. Brothers Basil, Thomas, Charles, and William Dorsey arrived in Philadelphia looking for work in the summer of 1836. Their father, a recently deceased Maryland slaveholder named Sabret Solers, promised to free them upon his death. He had omitted that guarantee in his will. Purvis hired the brothers and their wives to work at his farm. But in 1838, one of the Dorsey's brothers-in-law tipped off a slave catcher and the son of their former master. These men kidnapped Basil Dorsey from Purvis's farm in broad daylight. Purvis managed to secret the rest of the Dorseys to the house of another abolitionist and then rushed to the courthouse to help Basil. Purvis also enlisted the help of Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society lawyer David Paul Brown, a man whose dazzling oratory and legal acumen saved many Black Americans from slavery. When the trial began, Basil Dorsey dramatically proclaimed to the crowded courtroom, quote, "If the decision goes against me, I will cut my throat in the courthouse. I will not go back to slavery," end quote. Thankfully, Dorsey did not have to make good on his promise, as the combined forces of street diplomats Robert Purvis and David Paul Brown carried the day, allowing him to live the rest of his life in freedom. The actions of these street diplomats helped pave the way for and inform the strategies and networks that became the Underground Railroad. The threats faced by Black Philadelphians at the local level reflected the threats to their freedom at the state and national level. In 1842, the Supreme Court struck down Pennsylvania's 1826 Liberty Law. Justice Joseph Story, writing for the majority, stated that slaveholders possessed the right to retrieve fugitives from slavery from non-slaveholding states like Pennsylvania because the 1793 Federal Fugitive Slave Act contained, quote, "a positive and unqualified recognition of the right of the owner in the slave, unaffected by any state law or legislation whatsoever," end quote. Story then suggested that state officials could choose to exercise the authority to deal with fugitives from slavery under Article 4 of the Constitution or the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, unless, quote, "prohibited by state legislation," end quote. This phrase, "unless prohibited by state legislation," left open the possibility for future liberty laws in Pennsylvania, and in doing so, ensured the continuing struggle over Black freedom in Philadelphia. Throughout the summer of 1842, rumors spread within Philadelphia that a major attack on the Black population was imminent. The Black entrepreneur and street diplomat Stephen Smith built his beneficial hall that year as a replacement for Pennsylvania Hall. Such a display from an elite Black man inspired the male and female vigilant committees to organize a parade to celebrate the anniversary of the emancipation of the British West Indies on August 1st, 1842. Over 1,000 members of the Black-led young men and young women's vigilant associations marched down Lombard Street in South Philadelphia. Black Philadelphians' show of force overwhelmed white Philadelphians. A crowd of whites began pelting the procession with rocks and bricks. When a black man punched a white boy for hitting one of his fellow marchers, South Philadelphia erupted into a, quote, war, according to one witness. Hundreds of blacks and whites fought in the streets and sparked a 3-day anti-black riot that laid waste to Black Philadelphia. The rioters targeted symbols of black achievement, destroying street diplomat Stephen Gloucester's Second Presbyterian Church, as well as Stephen Smith's Beneficial Hall. They also targeted specific street diplomats, including Robert Purvis, who spent 3 days waiting on his stairs with a loaded rifle, prepared to fight to the death. We can only imagine the nightmares tumbling through his mind as the mob surged outside his home. Purvis survived the ordeal, and while his and other vigilance committees sought more clandestine means of protecting blacks in Philadelphia in the coming years, their work as street diplomats inspired and made possible the success of the Underground Railroad across the United States. The final chapter of my book focuses on the passage of the 1847 Pennsylvania Liberty Law, which involved black and white abolitionists successfully lobbying the state legislature to rescind state assistance for federal slave rendition under the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act, which was a process that required coordination at the local, state, and national levels. Black Americans at the local level experienced a precarious freedom in Philadelphia, but never lacked the will to resist, nor the opportunity to work alongside their white allies. The inspiring collaborations between white and black Americans through street diplomacy at the local level not only produced Pennsylvania's liberty laws, but also saved hundreds, if not thousands, of black Americans. Street diplomats' main goal was to convince Americans that all, quote, legal fugitive slave removals were kidnappings by uniting these already intertwined phenomena. Slaveholders, kidnappers, and slave catchers operated in a similar, though diametrically opposed manner. They purposefully identified free black Americans with enslaved black Americans, hoping that other Americans would remain indifferent when they witnessed the arrest of any black American. The forces of freedom and the forces of slavery both had an interest in conflating matters. Slaveholders conflated federal law with comity to save the Union, and abolitionists conflated the removal of any fugitive from slavery with an attempted kidnapping to make the Union worth saving. I said earlier that slavery has everything to do with our fate as a nation, and the claim deserves an explanation. Through my study, through the course of this book, I found slavery brought together both the worst and life-affirming aspects of the human condition. The worst aspects of slavery are obvious: violence, rape, greed, and murder, not to mention the absolute separation of families in the midst of perpetual bloodshed and toil. But beautiful. How do we make beauty out of slavery? The beauty rests in the efforts made by Americans to free the enslaved at great personal risk to themselves. What motivated Americans to create laws to combat enslavement and protect runaways and Black Americans targeted as potential kidnapping victims? Americans fought these battles and made these sacrifices to help the most vulnerable members of their society because they believed that the most vulnerable deserved to pursue America's founding principles of freedom. That 19th century Americans desired freedom should give us pause, for we live in a time when almost 50 million people are enslaved on planet Earth. Slavery always remained enslaved to the pursuit of freedom. And despite the machinations of pro-slavery ideologues to convince Americans in the world of their supposed inherent supremacy of skin color, the true fate of our nation rested within those who believed in fundamental human equality and went to great lengths to show true humanity through the content and conduct of their character. The Underground Railroad in Philadelphia inherited and implemented the best lessons of street diplomacy, with Philadelphians like William Still leading the way. Still's journals contain hundreds of accounts of fugitives who were saved by Philadelphia abolitionists, black and white. In a time when we long for heroes, perhaps we ought to think long and deeply about how our nation is full of them. if we know where to look. And as these names may ring unfamiliar today, these people helped to achieve the freedoms we enjoy today. The quest for abolition in the United States did not happen overnight, was never linear, and featured innumerable tales of woe and heroism that echo across time. By the 1850s, Americans could no longer turn a blind eye to a Black American being assaulted in front of them. They were forced to decide whether to aid in their enslavement or secure their freedom. Slavery, fugitive slaves, and Black kidnapping victims served as a gut punch to American morality. As more Northerners became awakened to the fact that all forms of slavery were tantamount to kidnapping, again, that idea, slavery being tantamount to kidnapping, this is all due to the work of Philadelphia abolitionists, public opinion slowly shifted in favor of preserving a union without slavery rather than remaining in a union with slavery. The Civil War became street diplomacy writ large, yet slavery in all its intricacies could never completely fade away in America or in the world. We are living in the shadow of the charge made by street diplomat Robert Purvis in 1865 for us to remain at our post until, quote, slavery goes down so effectually that about it we can have no question or doubt, end quote. Questioning slavery's origins, politics, and realities today remains paramount if historians hope to realize the brute fact of slavery long, long ago. Thank you. I know I snuck in under 40 minutes there, but I'll stop sharing my screen.
Nicely done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. So please feel free to add your thoughts, questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We do have one to kick us off.
Sure.
Going back to the laws that were passed in the 1820s in Philadelphia, were those in response to the Missouri Compromise of 1820?
That's a great question. So what you find in the case of the 1820 Liberty Law, the same politicians who were involved in helping craft that law were also the same ones at the national level making pleas for the United States not to accept the expansion of slavery out west, which resulted in the Missouri Compromise. So the biggest proponents of keeping the slave state, free state balance were these Pennsylvania politicians who also happened to be implicated in helping craft the law along with white and Black allies in Philadelphia. Good question.
Right, and we just have a lot of comments in the chat saying thank you for the
that's so
stories
nice.
and the anecdotes and just how important that is to making this history come alive for students. So I'm curious, do you have kind of a favorite story or a story that really surprised you as you were doing your research?
Yeah, there are a couple of so the two that stick with me. One, I mean, they're both awful in a certain way, but there's something in it that like there's a mysterious aspect to one of them, and then there is again like this life affirming part to the second story. The first story, and just to show you that I'm not just like making things up. So I read this story. It's not a story. I mean, this is history. It happened. So a man in Georgia wrote a letter to the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society in, I believe, 1825, saying that as they were traveling around the state, they met this boy named Eli Harmon. He claimed that he had been kidnapped, that he was from Philadelphia, that here are some references. And that's just the letter, right? And then, but it's this one letter, mysterious, right? And so what the person from Georgia details in Eli Harmon's kidnapping is that the kidnappers took Eli Harmon from Philadelphia, and because they thought he was too light-skinned, forced him to work naked in the Maryland sun all summer to make him very tan so they could sell him down south. Because what you're looking at there, right, are the obviously it's like that's man's inhumanity to man. But what you're seeing is like this disgusting economy that results from kidnapping is that like they don't think that they can sell people for a certain price based on how they look. At the same time, they're taking advantage of the plausible deniability. We didn't know. So Eli Harmon, I keep that little note up there because we don't know what happened to him. We don't. So that's one story that like so it always kind of like nags at me for obvious reasons. And then the second story has to deal with I have to find. I want to say his name was William James. I not William James, William Smith. I have to find it. It's in the book. But this lawyer, David Paul Brown, who I mentioned, working with Robert Purvis, he explained to a crowd at Pennsylvania Hall of about a case he dealt with in the 1820s, where there was a man who was accused of being a runaway, and he was in jail, and David Paul Brown goes to visit him, and David Paul Brown says, well, if you're free, show me your papers. And so the man, obviously this shows you this black man, like, you had to hold on to those papers for dear life. If you lost them, they were gone. They knew that slave catchers would rip them up. And that I've read accounts of that. So anyway, so David Paul Brown is visiting this man, William Smith, in jail. And he looks at this paper, right? This freedom paper, right? Basically emancipating him, his manumission papers. And it says William Smith. And he's like, wait a minute, I know William Smith. You're not William Smith. William Smith that I know, that guy was hung decades ago. And so this is the crazy part. So it turns out William Smith, the real William Smith, who was going to be hung, was in jail at the same time that this man was in 1825 or 1826. And the man who was going to be hung said, look, where I'm going, I'm not going to need this. You take this. And he basically gave him his identity so that David Paul Brown later could recognize, oh my gosh. And then obviously the man's eventually freed, which shows you again, technically in the times he was not supposed to be, but it's just incredible how these situations pop up again and again. And I'd be remiss if I didn't just explain one more quick one, because I think this gives you a sense of how close these forces of, and I'm talking about like the forces of slavery and freedom within families. Like we talk about, the Brothers' War of the Civil War, where, oh my gosh, one of them's Johnny Reb and one's Billy Yank, and they're fighting. Well, how about this? The man I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, George Alberti, who was a professional slave catcher for 40 years, right? From his teens, when he started by grave robbing, to stealing bodies to give to the Southern students at the medical school in Philadelphia, eventually becomes a hangman, execution, like seriously, all the worst things that you can imagine, all the worst careers, boom, Alberti. He, as one of my advisors used to say, he made a career as a racist. And so George Alberti, right, the most loathsome character you can pull out, and nobody knows of him today. But if you were in Philadelphia in 18 whatever through, I mean, basically 1800 to 1870, you knew who he was. Anyway, so Alberti, right, loathsome figure. His uncle, through marriage, is Thomas Shipley. Who's Thomas Shipley? We don't know. We don't know. Thomas Shipley was the president of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. So think about that. Arguably, the country's most prolific slave catcher is in the same family, through marriage, as the president of the preeminent abolitionist society, not just in America, but in the world. So that's going to be the subject of my next book. But anyway, sorry. I could go on forever about that crazy stuff.
No, those are amazing stories. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you. Yes, makes for an interesting family.
Yeah,
Holidays.
holidays,
Yep,
yeah.
holidays. So let's go back a little bit further. One of our attendees asked if Ben Franklin's legacy in Philadelphia influenced the city's views on slavery.
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, so I'm friends with a couple of fun Franklin scholars, and on the one hand, we have to realize that Franklin really doesn't renege on slavery until very late in his life, which everybody acknowledges is wrong. We know toward the end of his life, he becomes, an honorary member of the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society. Presents his views to Congress. I don't know if his reputation has been tarnished. I mean, I think in many ways, Franklin comes off more as like the Northeast tinkerer than necessarily somebody who is dealing with enslavement on a day-to-day basis. Plus, you got to think about the diplomatic work too. But yeah, I mean, I don't. Franklin, I think, is just like such like a baseline founder. Like he doesn't spike like Jefferson and Hamilton do. They're like almost like weird like blue chip stocks. Yeah, so good question.
All right. What was the response to these laws by people outside of Philadelphia?
Uh, well, the South concocted conspiracy theory after conspiracy theory, spread it throughout all of their newspapers, saying that these northern agitators, like it's amazing. So these newspaper editors who are wealthy in the South, they know the deal. They know that the abolitionists are never more than like 2, 3, 4% of the entire population, 10% if you want to be generous. And so they try to paint all Northerners as like potential abolitionists or rabid abolitionists, and they spread this propaganda saying, you know, leading up to the law, they'll say, how dare Pennsylvania refuse to give back property that's enshrined in the Constitution? But then after the law is passed, typical response will be, this is great. Yeah, great. Like we saved the Union again, guys. Good job. Like everything was about this like very chaotic, but they were right. I mean, technically the whole system of slavery, that was the only thing that could end the Union, and it almost did. Right. And so these Southern slave owners who are also newspaper editors, they talk to each other. They're all plagiarizing each other's articles. And so, something happens in Philadelphia, it's going to be in Arkansas in a couple of days, and it's going to be the same exact sort of screed that you'd see in Virginia. So, yeah, in the South, not so positive. But then also in the North, it's kind of tough. I mean, especially Democratic-run newspapers, and that's not, it's Democrat of that time. Democratic-run newspapers at that time were talking about the most vile racist screed you could find. It was from I mean, not even stuff that, I mean, you don't want to repeat it, but so it depended on the audience. I mean, the abolitionists and the street diplomats that, I kind of like a nice umbrella term for, black, white abolitionists fighting against slavery. They were always a minority, no matter what. Like, I mean, even up until Fort Sumter, even probably through the Emancipation Proclamation, I mean, things took a long time. It took a long time, a lot of blood.
So a question about record keeping. Would the local government have a record of who was free and who was not?
Oh, man. So I love that question because with this talk, I always try to embed a couple of little like, threads for people to pull. And one of the threads that people typically pull is, wait a minute, Washington had enslaved people in Philadelphia, right? So states like Pennsylvania, because of the 1780 Gradual Emancipation Act, they had a whole registry system, right? Where if you were a slaver and you came into Pennsylvania with an enslaved person, you had to register with them within 6 months, or the person was free. Right? Now, George Washington, he is a slaver. He brings enslaved people. And so what Washington ends up doing is by the time 6 months almost starts rolling around, he'll go back down south very quickly and come back up with enslaved people, right, to start the clock. Now, we should be clear, there's a couple of reasons why we think he could have done that. One is he just not willing to register them because he's evil? Is he not willing to register them because his name's going to be affixed to that document and he'll be called a hypocrite? Is he not willing to write his name and affix his name to those documents because posterity, aka us, what would we think of him? So I mean, Washington is, he's just like all of history, but all the founders are complicated. So yeah, there was a registration system. So what the Pennsylvanians tried to do, especially some of the upstart abolitionist leaning members of the state legislature, what they would try to do is make the process as Byzantine and as overcomplicated and as bureaucratic as possible to prevent people from coming up to try to retrieve so-called enslaved property. And so there's registration. And so, but you see that's the one side of it, right? For the registration. Okay, so, well, if I'm going to try to retrieve somebody, I have to go through this process. Well, that's one thing. But then the opponents to that sort of legislation in the Pennsylvania legislature, they would try to pass legislation banning the emigration of Blacks into the state. They were even pushing the idea of a pass system where Blacks had to carry IDs around with them all the time. And whenever they went to a new township or county, they had to register. I mean, So these are it's like dueling bureaucracies in the state legislature there.
Everyone loves a good bureaucracy. Yep, that has not changed.
No.
Um, so Tiffany asks if you could please elaborate on the idea of the beauty of slavery in Philadelphia.
What I mean is that the beauty is in the relationships that are formed between Black and white Americans to help free other people. That's the beauty of it. I'm not saying that in any way, shape, or form enslaving human beings is beautiful. What I'm saying is that the beauty that can come out of it was the fact that Black and whites were able to come together and and you know address these confrontations in a variety of ways at a variety of levels. It's not just a matter of, oh my gosh, I need to find an abolitionist because I'm being threatened here. It's, wow, I know Thomas Shipley. Thomas Shipley knows me. I'm part of a secret network. I'm part of this clandestine network that is working with the acting committee. And none of this stuff, you can't find any of this stuff. They burn all their records on purpose because, I mean, the Underground Railroad, when it was operating, was illegal. Like the Underground Railroad is beautiful in the sense that it was illegal and it was the right thing to do in that time, right? Or in all time, not our time. So yeah, so like that's what I think is like these like collaborations and like the intimacy of these collaborations. One of the fascinating things that you find over and over again too is that the families always are coming together during these incidents, right? Where it's never just one person in a courtroom with a lawyer and then the judge. It's always an entire community comes together. And so there's these amazing stories of Black and white crowds forming inside Philadelphia courtrooms, spilling out into the streets as a show of force to intimidate and to rescue people. And in fact, there were times when that happened where Blacks and whites would lead or come together to actually physically remove those accused from the courthouse. And that happened. That was not an everyday occurrence in Philadelphia, but it certainly happened dozens of times that there's constant rescues in action. It was just the idea that these human beings are working together. That's what I found beautiful.
Okay, and then I think we have one more question. If anyone else has one, please feel free to add it. But it was a question about the house that you played in along the Underground Railroad and whether the current owners or the occupants had found anything related to the Underground Railroad at the site.
That's great. So the great thing about memory is, right, whenever you try to remember something, you're remembering the last time you remembered it. So I'm like trying to think. So I remember it being very rickety, dark, as you'd imagine, and we were like literally not allowed to. We weren't allowed to go. We were allowed to go there one time, but that was it. In terms of, and here's the tragedy, right? In terms of what the current owners would say, the house was raised and there's a beautiful suburban condo, so unfortunately it doesn't exist. But like that was a very powerful story because, especially in Philadelphia, you more often than not, you'll go to a restaurant and in some way, shape, or form, if you ask, was this a stop on the Underground Railroad? They'll say yes. Like it becomes like so touristy. But then when you go out to the country, I mean, I live technically right outside the city. I mean, a lot of abolitionists worked here and like their houses are legitimately here. And so, yeah, those houses, I mean, even someone like William Still's house, William Still, that, basically the founder of the Underground Railroad, his house, I think, is being demolished in Philadelphia. I mean, it's just, we forget, we forget.
Right, it's like George Washington slept here, right?
Exactly. Yeah,
Right.
exactly. Underground Railroad stop right here. Yeah.
Yep. Well, if we don't have any more questions, I just want to say thank you again to Elliott for joining us tonight. This was fabulous. Thank you to all of you for being here. And I will say, if you're ready for one more webinar this week, tomorrow night, NCHE is hosting another webinar. 3 academics who first began this conversation at our conference back in March will talk about how they can support K-12 educators. So that is tomorrow evening. We hope you will join us. And again, thank you, Elliott.
Thank
for
you.
being here tonight.
Thank you. Have a great night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
And Elliot, I just wanted to mention, I was born and lived in Montgomery County till I was 12. So when I saw
Oh, very cool.
yeah,
Local. That's Southeast PA. Can't forget. Can't forget.
definitely can't.
Well, great meeting everybody, and thanks. And if there's anything you need from me, and if any of those teachers have follow-up questions, obviously, or I mean, I don't know if people are still here. Obviously, you can send me some, feel free to share my email.
Will do. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Have a great night.